Do you know why you should never put a tall fence around your house? Do you know what kind of meat you should never eat in a crisis? Do you know why you should never hide your stockpile in the basement? And that doing that almost guarantees that you'll lose all your food, your ammo, or your gold and silver in times of social chaos. These are just some of the innocent mistakes that can cost you the life of someone you love. If you rely on a few very common, yet criminally ineffective home defense techniques to protect your family and your stockpile in a mass social and economic collapse. But the techniques that actually work are so counterintuitive, they will shock you, as they shocked me, even though I've been a U.S. Army officer for almost 22 years. My name is Steve Walker, and in this short webinar, I will explain why mainstream home defense strategies flat out don't work, and why relying on them actually paints a big bullseye on your home, leaving you and your family vulnerable, defenseless, and exposed against the savage scum that will rise with the coming crisis. I'll share with you the story of the two preppers that tested their home defense strategies in real social chaos. One lived to tell the tale, despite being crippled with arthritis and not having any money to spend on a conventional survival gear, while the rich, overconfident prepper was a lot less fortunate. What's more, if you stick until the very end of this presentation, I'll give you a few simple, tested tactics that are proven to protect your home, your family, and your life in times of social breakdown. When vicious gangs are beating defenseless old people inside their own homes, and when there's no 911 to call and no police to come to your help. And even though this might sound impossible now, I'll show you how to turn the most vulnerable house into an impenetrable home that deters criminals and thugs. No matter if your budget is so low you can barely afford to buy food, let alone home security gadgets. No matter if you've got less than an hour a day to put into prepping. And even if right now you don't even know where to start when it comes to making your home more secure, you'll finally be able to enjoy a deep, relaxing sleep without jumping from your bed every time you hear a strange noise in the middle of the night. And in a crisis, your family will get peace of mind knowing that rioting mobs can't enter your home, even if blood is running in the streets and it looks like all-out civil war. Because the techniques I'm about to expose don't come from books. They're taken from actual 21st century war zones, from lawless states where social chaos is the name of the game, and where not having enough time or money to prepare doesn't stop real-world preppers from creating virtually impenetrable defenses for their families. I have seen firsthand what it's like to be thrown out of your own home like some rag doll, even when you thought you had all your corners covered. I was in another country when the unthinkable happened, and witnessed what looked like the rehearsal for what will come to America in the near future. It was January 23rd, 2011, when I landed in Cairo, Egypt, to visit my sister Hannah, who was studying archaeology there. I made it over to her house in a quiet neighborhood, not different from my own neighborhood. But just 2 days later, protesters began pouring into the streets of Cairo. These were the early days of the Arab Spring, and the people were determined to bring down the 30-year-old Mubarak regime. Hannah and I watched from behind the curtains of her window as the number of people in the streets began to swell. For the first few days, we almost felt as if the events were exciting, that it was cool to be a part of something historical. Yet, in a matter of a few hours, things changed from exciting to disturbing to downright scary. And then it happened, the most sickening preparedness lesson of my entire life. On January 28th, the president dissolved his government and attempted to shut down the internet across Egypt. What followed was utter pandemonium, as violent mobs of looters gradually took over the capital. Power outages crippled many neighborhoods, including my sister's. Hundreds of thousands of people swarmed into the streets of Cairo, and with no police in sight, calm almost instantly turned to chaos. We could hear gunshots outside and the roaring riots in the streets. That same night, while the mobs were going mad outside, we heard a frantic knocking on Hannah's door. It was Amir, her neighbor. "Come to my house now. I have plenty of food, water, and ammo," he said. It didn't take much convincing for us to follow him. Amir was a well-off Egyptian, and his house looked incredibly secure. A 10-foot wall surrounded his compound, and sure enough, he had a safe room stocked to the brim with food and water. He carried a 9mm with him at all times, but would play off and say he'd never need to use it. It struck me that Amir was like many American preppers. He had spent a small fortune to fortify his home. With our flights canceled, we were stuck at his place. But for the first time in days, we actually felt safe. We didn't know yet just how horribly wrong we were. Outside of our walls, rioters were starting to get desperate. It was their second day without food, as trucks had stopped supplying the grocery stores and everything had already been looted. The tension was so thick that we could feel it in our bones. There had been reports of gang rapes and random killings. We knew something bad was about to happen. One Sunday morning, Amir went outside to cook a small quartered lamb. With electricity out for days, the ice in his cooler had melted, and he didn't want the meat to spoil. We joined him in his courtyard, salivating at the smell coming off his fire pit. But we weren't the only ones. As the scent wafted into the air, we heard frantic shouting from directly outside the house. Suddenly, a man pulled himself over Amir's wall. Then more figures came over the wall. A whole flood of protesters descended into the compound. Amir screamed for us to come with him into his basement. Hannah and I started to follow, but I stopped her. My years of military training told me this was not right. So instead, I led her to the rear of the house. From a dark corner, terrified for our lives, we saw a horde of figures fighting one another like hungry werewolves over the small hunk of lamb. Dozens of others swarmed into the house. They emerged a moment later, dragging Amir as he screamed and begged. His pleas did nothing. They unlatched his entry door and threw him down on the ground. He reached for his pistol, but it was hopeless. At the sight of Amir going for his gun, the crowd began to stomp on his face, and one man grabbed a crude plank of wood and beat him mercilessly with it. Blood ran out into the streets, and soon Amir stopped making any sounds at all. That moment, I felt helpless, ashamed that I couldn't do anything to save my friend's life, and fearful that we might be the next on the list. But God had a different plan, and that's how I came to discover the survival tactics that not only saved us, but might save you and your family when a similar scenario hits the USA. But first, let me give you the 3 lessons that I learned from Amir's horrific murder. Pay attention, because knowing just one of these could save the lives of those you love when disaster strikes. Lesson number 1 is your real key to preventing invaders from getting into your home is not fences, walls, or protective barriers. In Amir's compound, I thought we were safe. But in a crisis situation where people are desperately looking for food and water, no one will think twice about breaking through your defenses. Even if the barriers around your perimeter seem dangerous, the idea of starving to death will scare intruders even more. There is, however,